Sarah Chen's alarm vibrated silently against her nightstand at 5:15 a.m., casting the dark bedroom in pale blue light. She reached for her phone with trembling fingers, not from sleepiness, but from the familiar anxiety that woke her every morning. For 5 years, that anxiety had been her companion, her shadow, the invisible hand that guided every decision. She'd learned to live with it, to breathe through it, to wear it like a second skin beneath her clothes. The clock read 5:16 a.m. In exactly 44 minutes. She would begin the third week of her employment at St. Grace Medical Center's emergency department. 3 weeks, 21 days, 504 hours since she'd first walked through those sliding glass doors with her new credentials, her new name embroidered on a temporary badge, and a carefully constructed history that could withstand surface-level scrutiny. Sarah rolled out of bed, a simple twin mattress on a metal frame, no box spring, no decorative pillows. Her apartment matched the bed, minimal, anonymous, forgettable. No photographs adorned the walls. No personal mementos cluttered the shelves. The refrigerator contained only essentials: milk, chicken breast, vegetables. She trained herself to exist without attachment to places, objects, or the comfortable clutter of normal life. Normal life left traces. Normal life created patterns. Normal life was dangerous. The shower ran hot, and she stood under the spray for exactly 8 minutes, her standard duration. Hot water long enough to relax muscles tight from anxiety, but not so long that it became a routine another person might notice. Everything about Sarah's existence was calibrated for invisibility. She dressed in her uniform, navy scrubs, white sneakers, minimal jewelry, and pulled her black hair into a tight bun. The reflection staring back from the bathroom mirror belonged to no one and everyone simultaneously. Pretty enough to be forgettable, thin enough to fade into background, young enough that people didn't ask too many questions, old enough that her youthfulness seemed intentional rather than suspicious. At 5:47 a.m. she consumed a protein bar and drank black coffee. Breakfast was fuel, nothing more. She'd stopped expecting food to bring pleasure years ago. The kitchen trash can receive the bar's wrapper. She washed the mug immediately, drying it with a paper towel she threw away. No dirty dishes in the sink. No evidence of habitation. By 6:02 a.m. she was in her 2011 Honda Civic, a forgettable sedan in a forgettable beige color, paid for in cash from carefully accumulated savings, registered under her new identity. The drive to St. Grace Medical Center took 17 minutes. She left at 6:08 a.m. every day. She left at 6:08 a.m. The hospital emerged from the pre-dawn darkness like a ship cutting through fog. St. Grace occupied an entire city block in downtown Portland, its concrete and glass facade reflecting the scattered streetlights. Sarah had researched this hospital obsessively before applying. Teaching hospital. Level 1 trauma center, high-volume emergency department, excellent reputation. Exactly the kind of place where a new nurse could disappear into the machinery of organized chaos. She'd submitted her applications electronically, her transcripts clean and legitimate. She'd earned her nursing degree honestly through night classes and weekend clinicals, working part-time jobs that paid in cash, maintaining a perfect 3.95 GPA despite her fractured existence. The background check had taken 3 weeks. Sarah had held her breath for all 21 days, checking her email obsessively, waiting for the inevitable discovery. But nothing came. The degree was real. The references were real, former instructors who remembered her as quiet, studious, exceptionally dedicated. The hospital had offered her a position in the emergency department, and she'd accepted with professional enthusiasm that masked the electrical surge of relief running through her veins. A job meant income. Income meant she could stop working cash-under-the-table positions. Income meant she could maintain her new identity more convincingly. The employee parking lot was nearly empty at 6:22 a.m. Sarah parked in her assigned spot, A47, the same spot every day, and sat in her car for 4 minutes. She reviewed the hospital map in her mind. She'd walked through it dozens of times before her first shift, memorizing hallways, exits, supply closets, blind spots. Nurses lived in a different ecosystem than patients and visitors. They knew the hidden architecture of institutions, the service corridors and back stairwells, the places where someone could disappear for 20 minutes without explanation. Sarah had learned to think like a ghost, to move through the world nodding exits and escape routes. The emergency department doors slid open at 6:31 a.m. The morning shift hadn't truly begun, but the night shift skeleton crew moved through the like they were wadding through honey. A man with a dislocated shoulder slumped in a waiting room chair. A woman coughed violently into her elbow, eyes watery with illness. Two police officers escorted a handcuffed man toward the secure holding area. The fluorescent lights hummed their relentless electric song. The smell hit her immediately. Disinfectant and sickness and human suffering, that particular bouquet of hospital air that never quite washed away. Linda Kowalski, the charge nurse, was reviewing charts at the main desk. She looked up and smiled, warm, genuine, the kind of smile that made Sarah's stomach clench with complicated guilt. Linda was training her. Linda believed in her. Linda had no idea that Sarah Chen was not actually Sarah Chen, that her history was a fabrication, that beneath the carefully maintained exterior lived a woman running from shadows that occasionally had faces. "Good morning, Sarah," Linda said, gesturing her over. "Let's get you oriented. Today's going to be interesting. We're understaffed because Marcus called in sick, and the paramedics are predicting a busy day. We might even see some real action." Sarah nodded and followed Linda, pulling out her small notebook where she'd begun documenting procedures and protocols. She'd filled 3 notebooks already in 3 weeks, writing observations late into her nights. Every shift she studied. Every shift she memorized. Every shift she prepared herself for something. She didn't fully understand what. Some part of her consciousness, the part shaped by 5 years of fear, of constant vigilance, of assuming the worst, whispered that she was training for something specific. That her desperate obsession with medical knowledge wasn't random. That something inside her already knew she would need this. By 6:47 a.m., Sarah had restocked the trauma bay supply cart, reviewed the day's anticipated procedures, and reviewed the names of patients currently in the ER. An elderly man with chest discomfort occupied Bay 3. A woman suffering migraines was in Bay 5. A child with a suspected broken arm waited in pediatrics. The morning was beginning in its ordinary, predictable fashion. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she pulled on her latex gloves. 3 weeks into her nursing career. Just another shift. Just another ordinary day. But something electric hummed beneath her skin, an anticipation she couldn't quite name. By 9:47 a.m., everything would change. The siren started at 9:47 a.m. Sarah was standing at the medication dispensary when the first wail penetrated the hospital's walls. She froze, her hand hovering over a bottle of acetaminophen. The sound was different from the occasional ambulance that passed through the city. This was urgent, primal, and it wasn't alone. One siren became 2, 2 became 3. By the time the 4th siren screamed into the distance, every nurse in the emergency department had gone absolutely still, their eyes meeting in that moment of crystalline clarity that precedes disaster. "Multi-vehicle on I-5, Linda's voice cut through the building tension. She was staring at her phone, reading the dispatch alert. 7 patients inbound, ETA 6 minutes, trauma alert, everyone to your stations. The emergency department transformed instantly. It was like watching a 1,000-piece puzzle reassemble itself in fast forward. Nurses rushed toward supply stations. Residents and attending physicians materialized as if summoned by magic. The waiting room, which had been comfortably occupied by only a handful of patients, suddenly felt like a war room preparing for battle. Sarah moved on instinct, her careful study of the hospital's architecture and protocols clicking into place like a key turning in a lock. Linda caught her arm. "Sarah, you stay back in this one. Observe. Help with supplies if you're asked. These are serious cases and I need you focused on learning, not on being in the way. Understand?" Sarah nodded obediently, but something inside her was already awake, something ancient and prepared. Her hands had stopped trembling. Her breathing had become steady and controlled. The anxiety that had been her constant companion that morning had transformed into something else, laser-focused concentration. The first ambulance arrived at 9:53 a.m. The paramedics burst through the trauma bay doors with a pregnant woman on a stretcher, her belly grotesquely swollen, her face twisted in agony. Blood matted her blonde hair. Her left arm hung at an unnatural angle. The paramedic leading the charge shouted vitals while running. Female, 32 weeks pregnant, severe head trauma from impact, probable internal bleeding, BP dropping, 180/110, heart rate 135, respiration rapid and shallow. Sarah watched as Dr. James Martinez, the attending trauma physician, stepped forward. He was competent, experienced, but Sarah could already see the calculations flickering across his face. A pregnant woman with a severe head injury was a nightmare scenario. Every intervention that might save her could harm the baby. Every choice was a knife's edge. The woman's eyes were unfocused, her pupils dilating, a telltale sign Sarah recognized from her obsessive late-night study sessions. Epidural hematoma, blood pooling between the skull and brain. Without intervention, she would have a stroke. The baby would die. She would die. The clock was ticking. Sarah moved without thinking. She was beside Dr. Martinez, her voice steady and clear. Stat CT scan of head and abdomen. She's showing signs of epidural hematoma, dilating pupils, rapid breathing, consciousness deteriorating. If we don't get imaging in the next 5 minutes, we'll lose her cerebral perfusion. Everyone froze. Sarah was a 3-week nurse. She wasn't supposed to speak. She wasn't supposed to make recommendations, but Dr. Martinez's eyes flickered, something clicking into recognition. "Get imaging set up now," he ordered. "Tell OB we're bringing them a potential emergency delivery." The second ambulance arrived before the first was fully processed. A construction worker, his leg crushed beneath a metal beam, unconscious and bleeding. His femur was clearly fractured. The paramedics estimated he'd lost 2 units of blood already. His skin was pale, clammy, the color of approaching death. Linda was already setting up the trauma bay, calling for O-negative blood, preparing the surgical team. But Sarah saw something else. She saw the way his abdomen was distended. She saw the subtle way his pelvis appeared unstable. "Pelvic fracture," she said quietly to the resident working the case. "Massive trauma, probably internal bleeding in the peritoneal cavity." The resident, a young man named Dr. Chen, no relation, looked at her with surprise and skepticism. But he ordered the imaging anyway. When the CT scan came back, it confirmed Sarah's assessment. The construction worker had a complex fracture pattern that required immediate surgical intervention. Without her observation, they might have focused entirely on the crushed leg and missed the life-threatening internal injuries. Ambulances 3, 4, and 5 arrived in rapid succession. An elderly couple from the backseat of a sedan, both unconscious, both with serious injuries. A teenager from another vehicle with chest trauma and difficulty breathing. A middle-aged man with severe lacerations across his body. The trauma bay became an orchestra of controlled chaos, with Linda as the conductor. Sarah moved through it like water, anticipating needs before they were expressed. When the elderly woman, later identified as Margaret, age 73, began to show signs of shock, Sarah was already preparing the compression lines, had already flagged the attending to check for internal bleeding. When the teenager's breathing became labored, Sarah recognized the signs of a tension pneumothorax and guided the resident toward a needle decompression before the patient coded. Her hands moved with muscle memory she didn't consciously possess, finding veins with the first attempt, securing lines with practiced efficiency, calling out oxygen saturation levels before anyone could ask for them. By 10:15 a.m., the sixth and seventh patients had arrived. Sarah's shifts at various pre-nursing jobs, drawing blood at clinics, working as a patient transporter, volunteering in different departments, suddenly made sense. All those nights of studying, of memorizing protocols, of preparing herself for something she didn't know was coming. It was as if her subconscious had been training her entire body for this exact moment. The crisis deepened. The elderly man, Edward, Margaret's husband of 52 years, began to deteriorate rapidly. His oxygen saturation dropped. His consciousness faded. Sarah was standing nearby when he crashed. Without waiting for instructions, she moved to his side. "He needs a central line," she said to Dr. Martinez, who was struggling to get peripheral access on the traumatized veins. "Subclavian approach. I can assist." Dr. Martinez, exhausted and impressed despite himself, nodded. Sarah guided him through the procedure with quiet competence, her hands steady, her knowledge absolute. The central line was placed successfully. Edward's condition stabilized, not recovered but stable, salvageable. By 10:45 a.m., the chaos had transformed into order. 7 patients, all critical, all alive, all because a 3-week nurse with an impossible past and inexplicable knowledge had moved through the trauma bay like she'd been doing this for decades. The pregnant woman was prepped for emergency surgery. The construction worker was in the OR with surgeons working to repair his pelvis and abdomen. The elderly couple was stabilized in the ICU, holding hands across adjacent beds. The teenager would recover. The middle-aged man would need plastic surgery, but he would survive. The other 2 patients, a woman with severe fractures and a man with internal bleeding, were conscious and responsive. As the immediate crisis passed, Sarah found herself standing alone in a supply room, her hands shaking now that the adrenaline was fatting. She'd saved 7 people in 1 hour. She'd broken every rule about staying in her lane, about remaining a subordinate, about not drawing attention to herself. She'd violated the most fundamental principle of her existence, invisibility. And there was absolutely nothing she could do to take it back. The shift ended at 2:45 p.m., but Sarah remained in the hospital until 3:30 p.m., completing documentation and trying to make herself invisible in the way she'd perfected over 5 years. It didn't work. Every time she tried to slip quietly away, someone intercepted her. That was incredible, a second-year resident told her near the medication dispensary. "I've never seen someone move like that in a trauma situation. Where did you study before here?" Sarah's stomach clenched. She'd prepared answers for this question, answers that were true enough to be verifiable but vague enough to avoid scrutiny. "University of Washington Nursing Program," she said. 4 years, finished 2 years ago." The resident nodded, satisfied, but something in his eyes suggested he was filing the information away, comparing it against the impossible competence he'd witnessed. Sarah had made a critical mistake during the crisis. She'd been too good. She'd revealed too much. The drive home took 17 minutes, but Sarah's hands didn't stop shaking for the first 10 of them. She'd replayed every moment of the emergency dozens of times, analyzing each intervention, each piece of knowledge she demonstrated. Most rookie nurses made mistakes in crisis situations. Most second- or third-year nurses had gaps in their knowledge. Most people didn't possess the clinical instincts she displayed. Her apartment felt smaller when she returned. A cage she'd constructed so carefully now felt less like shelter and more like a trap. She sat on her bed, not bothering to remove her scrubs, and let the weight of the day settle across her shoulders like a lead blanket. Her phone buzzed, a text from Linda. "Can we grab coffee tomorrow before your shift? I want to talk about today." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. This was how it started. This was how people began to unravel. You did something impressive. Someone wanted to talk. Questions escalated. Background checks deepened. Inconsistencies emerged. The entire construction of false identity collapsed. She texted back, "Of course, thank you for the opportunity to help today." The response came immediately. "You didn't just help, Sarah. You saved lives. We need to talk about your future here." Sarah set the phone down and stared at her ceiling. Tomorrow. She had until tomorrow morning before she had to face the conversations, the questions, the attention. Tonight, she could still exist in the careful silence she'd cultivated. Tomorrow, she would begin the delicate process of managing her new visibility. But visibility was her greatest fear. The next morning arrived too quickly. Sarah dressed in fresh scrubs, drank her coffee with mechanical precision, and drove to the coffee shop where she'd agreed to meet Linda. The cafe was crowded with the mid-morning rush, people ordering lattes, working on laptops, conducting business with the casual assumption that their lives were safe and stable. Sarah envied them with an intensity that bordered on physical pain. Linda was already seated at a small table near the window when Sarah arrived. The charge nurse looked tired, her hair still damp from her shower, but her eyes were bright with something that might have been excitement or concern or both. "Thank you for meeting me," Linda said, gesturing to the empty chair. "I ordered you a black coffee. I noticed you always drink it black." The observation made Sarah's pulse quicken. Linda had been watching her, cataloging details, creating a mental file of Sarah Chen's habits and preferences. This was how surveillance began, casual observations that accumulated into something impossible to ignore. "I wanted to talk about yesterday," Linda continued. "In 18 years of nursing, in working with hundreds of new staff members, I have never seen anything like what you did in that trauma bay. The knowledge you demonstrated, the instincts you showed, that's not something you learn in nursing school." Sarah maintained her expression. "I studied very thoroughly during my education." "I don't doubt that," Linda said. "But this goes beyond studying. You anticipated needs before they arose. You identified complex injuries that required physician-level assessment. You guided experienced residents through procedures. Sarah, I need to ask you directly, where did you actually train?" The question hung in the air between them like a guillotine blade. Sarah made a choice, not the choice of honesty that was impossible, but the choice of acceptable deflection. "I've always been driven to understand medicine," she said carefully. "Before nursing school, I worked in several healthcare settings. I learned by observation and by asking questions." "What kind of work?" Linda pressed gently. "Various positions, patient transport, phlebotomy. I wanted to understand the field before committing to nursing school." Linda nodded slowly, and Sarah couldn't read whether she was satisfied or simply cataloging more information. "Well, Dr. Martinez was very impressed. He's already talking to administration about fast-tracking you through your orientation period. There's an interest in moving you into the trauma unit permanently." This should have been good news. This should have been a validation of her skills, a pathway to advancement. Instead, it felt like being chosen for execution. Over the next 3 days, more questions came. Dr. Martinez asked about her educational background in a clinical context. A staff nurse named Jennifer mentioned, somewhat pointedly, that she'd looked Sarah up on social media and couldn't find any presence whatsoever. "That's so unusual for someone your age," Jennifer had said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Most people have Instagram, Facebook, something." Sarah had explained that she valued privacy. It was true. What she didn't explain was that privacy was survival. On Thursday afternoon, 6 days after the emergency, Sarah found an envelope in her hospital mailbox. Her name was written on it in black ink, no return address. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a single piece of white paper, 3 words printed in a standard font. "We know everything." The paper fell from Sarah's fingers as if it had burned her. "We know everything. Not we know something. Not we have questions. Everything." The word that encompassed her entire fabricated existence, her false identity, her 5 years of strategic invisibility. Someone had found her. Someone was reaching out in a way designed to terrify. Sarah locked herself in a bathroom stall and forced herself to breathe. This was what she'd feared since day one. This was the reason she'd constructed such careful anonymity. This was why invisibility mattered. Being seen, being known, being discovered, it all ended the same way. She flushed the paper down the toilet and watched it disappear into the municipal water system. But she couldn't flush away the knowledge that someone had placed that paper in her mailbox. Someone inside this hospital. Someone who worked here. Someone who knew exactly where to find her. For the first time in 6 days, since the moment the sirens had shattered the quiet morning, Sarah allowed herself to consider the possibility that her new life was already ending, that her carefully constructed identity was crumbling, that the past she'd run from was no longer behind her. It was reaching for her with steady, inevitable hands. The call came on Thursday morning at 6:47 a.m., 3 days after the mysterious letter. Sarah was still in bed, having called in sick for the first time since beginning at St. Grace. She'd spent the past 72 hours in her apartment, barely eating, barely sleeping, replaying conversations and analyzing every possible way her identity could have been compromised. The anonymous letter sat in her mind like a splinter, impossible to remove, increasingly infected. Ms. Chen. The voice was male, authoritative, carrying the particular cadence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. This is Special Agent Morrison with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We need to speak with you immediately regarding a matter of national security importance. We'll be at your residence in approximately 20 minutes. Please remain available. The line went dead. Sarah's body reacted before her mind could process the information. Her hands began to shake. Her vision narrowed. Her stomach twisted with the particular nausea that accompanies the complete collapse of carefully constructed reality. The FBI, not a private investigator, not hospital administration. The FBI. The words national security importance reverberated in her skull like a struck bell. She had 20 minutes. Sarah spent the first 5 minutes standing motionless in her bedroom, her brain cycling through impossible scenarios. She could run. The cash she'd saved for emergencies was hidden in a bank deposit box downtown. She could be on a highway within 2 hours, but run where? Her face was burned into hospital records now. Her fingerprints were in the system from her background check. Her nursing license was registered with the state. There was nowhere left to hide. She showered mechanically, pulled on fresh clothes, and made her bed with the precision that had become second nature. If she was going to be arrested, she would be arrested in a clean apartment. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her disintegrate. The knock came exactly 22 minutes later. They weren't in uniforms. That somehow made it worse. Special Agent Morrison was in his early 50s, his face carved from harsh angles and harder experiences, his suit immaculate but worn in the way of a man who'd slept in cars and interrogation rooms. Special Agent Patel was younger, maybe 35, with kind eyes that somehow felt more threatening than Morrison's coldness. Kind eyes belonged to people who could justify terrible things to themselves. "Ms. Sarah Chen?" Morrison asked, not as a question but as a confirmation of something he already knew. "Yes," Sarah whispered. "We need to speak with you about your background. May we come inside?" Sarah stepped aside, her body operating on autopilot while her mind screamed. They filed into her apartment with the particular invasiveness of people trained to occupy space, to make themselves at home in violation of everything sacred. Morrison's eyes scanned her living room, the bare walls, the minimal furniture, the absence of personal artifacts, and something flickered in his expression. Recognition, perhaps, or confirmation of suspicion. They sat at her small dining table, the one where Sarah had never actually eaten a meal because eating was fuel and fuel was consumed alone. Morrison opened a thick folder. Patel positioned his pen above a notebook, ready to record every word. "Sarah Chen, or should we say Sarah Marie Patterson," Morrison began. The use of her real name struck like a physical blow. Sarah Marie Patterson. She hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in 5 years. Hearing it now, in this apartment from this federal agent, made her feel like she was being split into two separate people, the woman sitting at the table and the ghost from Michigan. 5 years ago, you were reported missing by your parents in Detroit, Morrison continued, laying out photographs. There was Sarah, younger, with different hair, different weight distribution, different eyes. A missing persons poster from 5 years ago. The photocopy was yellow with age, the kind of image that represented hope slowly transforming into despair. Your case file was opened on March 15, 2019, Morrison said, sliding the paperwork across the table. You were 23 years old. You disappeared from your apartment without explanation. Your car remained in your parking lot. Your phone was found in your bedroom. For 18 months, your family reported activity to police. Tips came in. Theories were developed. Then, gradually, the case went cold. You became another missing young woman in the statistical wilderness. Sarah couldn't look at the photographs. Looking at them meant acknowledging a history she'd spent 5 years actively forgetting. However, Patel interjected, his tone almost gentle, approximately 6 months ago, our background check systems flagged an anomaly. A nursing school graduate in Portland, Oregon with your physical description, but applying under the name Sarah Chen. We cross-referenced facial recognition technology. We ran biometric analysis. Ms. Patterson, we are absolutely certain that you are the same individual who disappeared 5 years ago from Michigan. Morrison leaned forward. What we want to know is, where have you been, who helped you disappear, and perhaps most importantly, why? Sarah's mouth was dry. She wanted water. She wanted to scream. She wanted to run. She did none of these things. Instead, she sat motionless, her hands folded on the table in front of her. Before you answer, Morrison said, I need to inform you that lying to federal agents is a felony. However, we're not here to arrest you. We're here because your case intersects with a larger investigation we've been conducting, one that you might be the key to solving. I want to understand, Morrison said, his voice becoming almost conversational, how a young woman who was reported missing, declared a potential crime victim, goes completely dark for 5 years and then reappears as a completely different person with apparently legitimate credentials, and in her 3rd week of employment, performs medical interventions with the competence of someone with decades of experience. That's an interesting story, Ms. Patterson. Sarah. Whatever you want to call yourself, we'd like to hear it. The folder that Morrison opened next contained more photographs, images of a crime scene, a man's face, battered and broken, documents mentioning her name, news articles about an investigation that had never been publicly closed. Sarah's voice, when she finally spoke, was barely a whisper. If I tell you everything, will you arrest me? That depends on what you tell us, Morrison said. But understand this. Your parents have been grieving for 5 years. Your sister went to college not knowing if her sister was alive or dead. That has consequences, Sarah. Those consequences need to be addressed one way or another. Sarah looked at the photographs of her past life, evidence of a woman who had ceased to exist, and she made a decision that would either save her or destroy her completely. She began to speak. They moved her to an official FBI interview room at the downtown field office. Not a cell, not technically a detention space, but the absence of windows and the single door that locked from the outside made it feel like a tomb. Sarah sat across from Morrison and Patel, a small recording device spinning silently on the metal table between them, capturing every word she spoke. I want you to understand, Morrison said, that this conversation is being recorded. You're not under arrest, but anything you say can and will be documented. If you'd like an attorney present. I don't want an attorney, Sarah said quietly. I want to stop running. The words surprised even herself. She'd been preparing for this moment for 5 years without realizing she was preparing. Every study session, every careful choice, every night spent in her minimal apartment had been a form of waiting, of purgatory, of hoping that eventually the truth would set her free. She took a breath and began. His name was Marcus Chen, she said. I met him in my senior year of college at University of Michigan. He was a graduate student in business, older, sophisticated, seemed to know everyone. I was 22, naive and flattered by his attention. Sarah's voice was steady now, as if speaking about a character in a book rather than her own life. We dated for 6 months. At the time, I thought he was wonderful. Looking back, I realized he was grooming me, that he'd chosen me specifically. Patel was writing, his pen moving steadily across his notebook. Morrison's expression remained neutral, but his eyes were intense, absorbing every word. In March 2019, Marcus asked me to help him with something. He said a friend needed assistance retrieving personal documents from a storage unit. I said yes because I loved him and I would have done anything he asked. Sarah's voice cracked slightly. We went to the storage facility on the evening of March 12th. There was a man already there, someone Marcus seemed to know. At first, I thought we were retrieving documents. She stopped, gathering the courage to continue. The man was already injured when we arrived. His face was, Sarah closed her eyes, seeing the image that had haunted her nightmares for 5 years. It was covered in blood, he'd been beaten. Marcus pulled out a baseball bat and he continued beating him. The man screamed. He begged. I screamed. I tried to run. Marcus grabbed me and told me to stay silent or I'd be next. Morrison leaned back slightly, his expression shifting to something that might have been understanding or might have been strategic sympathy. The man died, Sarah whispered, right in front of me. Marcus made me watch the last minutes of his life. Then he told me that I'd never speak about what I'd seen, that no one would believe me anyway, that if I said anything, my family would die. He described my parents' house. He described my sister's college campus. He knew everything about my life. Did you go to the police? Patel asked gently. Yes, Sarah said. 2 days later. I was terrified, but I was also angry, and I thought the justice system would protect me. I went to the Detroit Police Department and asked for someone I could trust. They assigned me to Detective Robert Walsh. The name hung in the air like a curse. Walsh was kind, Sarah continued. He seemed to take me seriously. He told me that Marcus Chen had connections, family ties to organized crime, relationships with dangerous people. He said that a formal investigation would put me in immediate danger because it would alert Marcus that I'd come forward. He said that witness protection programs took time, that I was safer if I simply disappeared immediately. What exactly did he tell you? Morrison asked, leaning forward. He said I should go to California, assume a new identity, establish a legitimate background, and wait. He said he'd handle the investigation quietly, that he'd build a case without alerting anyone that I'd cooperated. He gave me cash, $3,000, and he drove me to the bus station himself. He told me to get a new phone, find an apartment, get a job, and live quietly. He said the less contact I had with my old life, the safer I would be. Sarah's hands were shaking now. I believed him completely. I thought he was protecting me. I thought my family would eventually understand. I thought this was temporary. But it wasn't temporary, Morrison said. No, Sarah whispered. I never heard from Walsh again. I got to California with nothing. I found a job cleaning offices at night and living in a hostel. After 3 months, I'd saved enough for an apartment. After a year, I enrolled in community college. I studied obsessively, nursing, medical procedures, anything that would let me feel like I was building towards something real. After 3 years, I applied to nursing school. The entire time, I was waiting for Walsh to tell me it was safe to come home. He never called, Patel said. He never called, Sarah confirmed. I tried to reach out once after 2 years. I sent an email to his police department email address. It bounced back as user does not exist. That's when I realized something was wrong. That's when I understood I'd been abandoned. Sarah looked directly at Morrison for the first time. I've spent 5 years building a new life from nothing. I've worked 3 jobs while going to school. I've taught myself medical knowledge that most nurses don't acquire until they've been practicing for years. I've lived alone, told no one my story, trusted no one. I did everything Detective Walsh told me to do. I disappeared completely, and I would still be disappeared if I hadn't performed well at a hospital for 3 hours. Tell me about the man who died, Morrison said quietly. Sarah closed her eyes. His name was David Caruso. He was 48 years old. He had a wife and 3 children. Marcus Chen killed him over a gambling debt. According to the limited information I could find online over the years, the crime was never officially solved. David's family never got closure. His wife died 8 years later. I looked that up too. His children grew up without knowing what happened to their father. Her voice strengthened. I've carried that guilt for 5 years. The guilt of knowing what happened and being unable to tell anyone. The guilt of living while he died. The guilt of watching my parents grieve a daughter they thought was dead when I could have been home, when I could have testified, when I could have helped bring justice. Walsh was fired from the Detroit Police Department in 2021 for serious misconduct, Morrison said, watching her reaction carefully. We've been investigating him for 3 years. We believe he was helping criminals, providing protection, facilitating disappearances, hiding people from investigations. Your case would be one of at least 7 cases where his intervention appears suspicious. Sarah understood immediately. She hadn't been protected, she'd been hidden, and not for her safety, for theirs. He was making money, she said flatly. He was paid to make me disappear, to hide me, to prevent my testimony. We believe so, Morrison confirmed. And we think Marcus Chen paid him very well. What we need from you now is your testimony, about what you saw, about Walsh's involvement, about everything. Sarah looked at her hands, the same hands that had saved 7 lives less than 2 weeks ago, the same hands that had been forced to watch murder. Okay, she said, I'll tell you everything, but I need to know, will I be able to go home? Will I be able to see my family again? Morrison and Patel exchanged a glance. That's something we can work on, Morrison said. But first, we need to rebuild your original case file. We need you to reconstruct every detail of March 12, 2019. We need the names, the locations, the evidence. We need to finally get justice for David Caruso and closure for his family. Sarah took a deep breath and began to speak. For the first time in 5 years, she recounted the night that had stolen her life, every terrible, specific, traumatizing detail. And as she spoke, something shifted inside her. The burden of silence began to lift. Finally, she was being heard. Share artifacts, download all image generation prompts document. MD Part 8 expanded 1,000 words document. MD Part 7 expanded 1,000 words document. MD Part 6 expanded 1,000 words document. MD Part 5 expanded 1,000 words document. MD Part 4 expanded 1,000 words document. MD Part 3 expanded 1,000 words document. MD Part 2 expanded 1,000 words document. MD Part 1 expanded 1,000 words document. MD Rookie Nurse Story document. MD The conference room at the FBI field office was different from the interrogation room, larger, with windows that looked out onto the city skyline, with a long table laden with documents, photographs, and digital displays. Sarah had been moved here after 12 hours of continuous confession, her voice now hoarse from speaking, her mind numbed by the weight of her own history. Morrison entered carrying 2 additional folders and a tablet displaying surveillance footage. You need to understand what we've discovered, he said, positioning the materials in front of her. Your case was the key that unlocked everything about Detective Robert Walsh. Patel dimmed the lights and activated the tablet. Surveillance footage from a parking garage appeared, grainy but clear enough to see Detective Walsh accepting an envelope from a man in an expensive suit. The timestamp read March 2019. This is Walsh receiving a payment, Morrison said. Approximately 48 hours after you came forward about David Caruso's murder, we recovered similar footage from 7 different exchanges over the course of 18 months. We've traced the payments to Marcus Chen's family enterprises. You weren't the first person Walsh helped disappear. You were just the one that made us suspicious enough to investigate him thoroughly." Sarah's stomach twisted. She'd thought her case was unique. She'd thought Walsh had protected her out of some warped sense of duty. The truth was far worse. She was simply one transaction in a criminal economy. "Marcus Chen," Morrison continued, pulling up a photograph of the man Sarah hadn't seen since that night in the storage facility, "was arrested in 2022 on racketeering charges unrelated to David Caruso's death. He's currently serving 15 years in a federal prison in Colorado. His conviction has nothing to do with the murder you witnessed." Sarah felt something collapse inside her chest. "So I ran for nothing. He was going to prison anyway." "Not nothing," Patel interjected gently. "His family was building a case against him for financial crimes. They didn't need your testimony to imprison him. But David Caruso's family, they needed justice. They've been waiting 5 years for answers." Morrison opened the first folder. Inside were photographs of David Caruso, a man in his late 40s with warm eyes and a genuine smile, surrounded by his family at various life events. Birthday parties, a daughter's graduation, a vacation photo at the beach, normal moments from a normal life that had been violently erased. "David's wife, Catherine, died in a car accident in 2022, Morrison said quietly. "The accident report suggests depression and distraction were contributing factors. David's eldest son, Marcus Jr., no relation to the man who killed him, dropped out of college and never finished his degree. He struggled with substance abuse ever since. The youngest, Rachel, was only 14 when her father disappeared. She's now 19 and in therapy for complex trauma." Sarah's eyes flooded with tears. These weren't abstract victims anymore. They were real people whose lives had been destroyed by the murder she'd witnessed and by her subsequent silence. "We've been investigating Walsh since 2021, when his misconduct surfaced in an unrelated case," Morrison continued. "A confidential informant told us about a corrupt detective helping witnesses disappear in exchange for payment. We built a surveillance operation. Over 3 years, we documented Walsh coordinating at least 8 disappearances. 7 people are still missing, presumed dead or permanently relocated. You're the only one who resurfaced." "What do you mean, presumed dead?" Sarah asked. "Walsh may have been doing more than relocating witnesses," Patel said carefully. "We have reason to believe that some of the people who paid for disappearances may have later decided they wanted no loose ends. We're investigating whether Walsh was also making murders disappear." The room felt like it was spinning. Sarah had been so focused on her own survival that she'd never considered she might be part of a larger pattern of criminal activity. That her case, her suffering, was part of an industrial-scale operation to make inconvenient people vanish. "However," Morrison said, "we have good news for you specifically. The person who hired Walsh to make you disappear, Marcus Chen, is in federal prison and will be for at least another 13 years. Your physical safety is no longer in jeopardy from him. The threat that Walsh convinced you existed was either exaggerated or fabricated entirely." Sarah felt something shatter inside her, simultaneously breaking her apart and beginning to set her free. "You mean I've been hiding for nothing? For 5 years, I've been terrified of a man who was always going to be in prison anyway." "Not entirely nothing," Morrison said. "Your testimony is valuable in building the case against Walsh, but more importantly, your disappearance is valuable for understanding his methodology. Walsh coached you through this very carefully. He chose you deliberately, young, isolated, traumatized, vulnerable. He knew exactly which psychological buttons to push to make you disappear completely." Morrison pulled up files on the tablet. Walsh's script never varied. He would tell the disappearing person that immediate vanishing was safer than formal protection. He would provide just enough cash to seem legitimate but not enough to survive long-term, which forced you to establish verifiable history, jobs, employment records, legal documentation. That's what made you real. That's what made you impossible to find. by forcing you to build a legitimate life. Walsh was simultaneously protecting his investment and creating a trail he could follow if necessary. "He could have found me any time," Sarah said, understanding slowly dawning, "if he wanted to." "Yes," Morrison confirmed. "Your nursing school application, your employment at St. Grace, your driver's license, all of that was discoverable through standard background checks. But Walsh was in no hurry. As long as you stayed invisible and terrified, you weren't a threat. The moment you became visible, by saving those 7 lives, by being celebrated, by drawing attention, our systems flagged the anomalies in your identity. So you found me because I was good at my job," Sarah said bitterly. "We found you because you were extraordinary," Patel corrected. "Because you couldn't hide your genuine competence. That clinical knowledge, that instinct, that ability to function under pressure, that came from somewhere and it made you stand out. And standing out is what made you valuable to us." Morrison opened the second folder. Inside were photographs and documents related to Walsh's corruption network. Other officers, a DA who'd suppressed evidence, a judge who'd sealed records, an entire ecosystem of corruption operating invisibly within law enforcement itself. "We're building a comprehensive case against the entire operation," Morrison said. "We have evidence, witnesses, surveillance footage. But your testimony, the testimony of someone who experienced Walsh's methodology directly, who can describe his exact language and tactics, who can connect him to specific criminal payments, that's the centerpiece. That's what will make the jury understand the scope and intent of his crimes." "What happens to me if I testify?" Sarah asked. "You'll be called as a witness," Morrison said. "You'll give testimony in federal court. There will be a jury present. Cross-examination will be vigorous and hostile. Defense attorneys will attack your credibility. They'll try to suggest you're fabricating details or misremembering events. Will I be safe?" "You'll be protected during the trial period," Patel said. "After the convictions, and we're confident there will be convictions, you'll be offered victim assistance resources, relocation support if desired, and psychological services." Sarah looked out the window at the Portland skyline, at the city she'd rebuilt her life in, at the place where she'd finally become someone real and capable. "The question is," Morrison said, "are you willing to testify? Are you willing to give voice to David Caruso's death and to the 5 years you lost? Are you willing to help us dismantle the system that created your suffering?" Sarah thought about the 7 people she'd saved at St. Grace. She thought about David Caruso's children growing up without their father. She thought about all the other missing people, all the other families destroyed by Walsh's corruption. "Yes," she said quietly, "I'll testify. I want to testify." "Then we need to prepare you," Morrison said, "because what's coming next is going to be even harder than anything you've already endured." Federal prosecutors assigned to Sarah's case were 2 women in their late 40s, Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Huang and Prosecutor Linda Silverstein. They spent the first week teaching Sarah how to testify, how to withstand cross-examination, how to transform her trauma into coherent narrative that could survive legal scrutiny. "The defense will try to make you angry," Jennifer explained during a Saturday afternoon session in a quiet courthouse conference room. "They'll ask leading questions designed to provoke you. They'll imply you fabricated details or exaggerated events. They'll suggest that 5 years of lying about your identity makes you an unreliable narrator. You cannot lose your composure. You have to remain calm and clear, even when they're attacking your credibility." Sarah had spent the past week in a strange limbo. The hospital knew about her situation. The FBI had contacted administration directly. She'd expected to be fired. Instead, she'd received a call from Dr. James Martinez and hospital administrator Patricia Valdez asking her to come meet with them. She'd walked into Valdez's office expecting judgment. What she found was something entirely unexpected: support. "We've been informed of your situation," Valdez had said, her tone professional but genuinely compassionate. We understand you witnessed a serious crime and that law enforcement has asked for your cooperation. St. Grace Medical Center is committed to supporting employees who do the right thing. Your position here is secure, and we're prepared to provide you with whatever accommodations you need during the trial proceedings. Dr. Martinez had added, Sarah, what you did in that trauma bay, what you continue to do matters. Your medical competence is real. Your dedication to saving lives is genuine. None of that changes because of your past. If anything, understanding what you've survived makes your accomplishments more remarkable. The hospital's response had been a turning point. After years of expecting rejection, she'd instead found acceptance. They'd offered her flexible scheduling to attend trial preparation sessions. They'd connected her with the hospital's Employee Assistance Program for psychological counseling. Dr. Martinez had assigned her as a mentor to 2 new nurses in the trauma unit, cementing her position as someone valued and necessary. But the most transformative moment came in the second week of preparation. Sarah's phone rang at 9 p.m. on a Thursday. The voice on the other end made her drop the coffee mug she was holding. Sarah, her mother's voice, older than she remembered, was tentative and broken. "Oh my God, Sarah." The FBI had initiated contact with Sarah's family in Michigan. They'd explained the situation. They'd prepared them. But no amount of preparation could adequately capture the moment when a daughter presumed dead for 5 years suddenly became real again. "Mom," Sarah whispered, unable to say anything else. The conversation lasted 4 hours. Sarah's mother cried, massive, gasping sobs of relief and grief and rage and forgiveness. Her father got on the phone, and his voice was so changed by age and sorrow that Sarah barely recognized him. Her sister, now 26, wept and asked questions and apologized for things that weren't her fault. "We thought you were dead," her mother said repeatedly. "We grieved you, we buried you in our hearts, and you were alive and you were alone and we couldn't help you." "Mom, I couldn't contact you," Sarah explained, still operating under the logic that had governed her for 5 years. "The detective said it would put you in danger." "That detective lied to you," her father said harshly. "He lied to all of us. We've been told he was a criminal. Sarah, sweetheart, we forgive you. We understand now. But we can't forgive ourselves for letting you go so easily." By the end of the call, they'd made a plan. Sarah would travel to Detroit during the trial preparation to see her family. Not to stay. She wasn't ready to abandon her life in Portland, but to reconnect, to let her parents hold her, to prove to herself and to them that 5 years of silence could begin to be undone. The media caught wind of Sarah's story in week 3 of trial preparation. A journalist named David Kim, working for a regional news outlet, had been covering Detective Walsh's corruption investigation. The initial story had been about law enforcement misconduct, important but somewhat abstract. Then Kim discovered that one of Walsh's disappearances had resulted in an extraordinary story. A woman who'd vanished, rebuilt her entire life, and then performed medical heroics before being discovered by the FBI. The story he published bore the headline, "From Missing to Miraculous: How a Disappeared Witness Saved 7 Lives and Found Herself Again." Sarah had been terrified about media attention. The prosecutors had warned her that the story might generate publicity. What she hadn't anticipated was how the narrative would shift. Instead of being portrayed as a traumatized victim, she was featured as a woman of extraordinary resilience and competence. The article detailed her years of self-directed study, her obsessive preparation for a life of purpose, her transformation from frightened girl into capable healer. More importantly, the story reframed the conversation around Detective Walsh from abstract corruption to concrete human harm. The article included interviews with David Caruso's son, Marcus Jr., who spoke about growing up without his father. It featured Rachel Caruso, David's daughter, who talked about her 16 years of unanswered questions and her hope that testimony would finally bring closure. The public response was overwhelming. Sarah received hundreds of messages on social media, people sharing their own stories of law enforcement corruption, of lost loved ones, of systems that had failed them. Victims' rights organizations reached out. News outlets requested interviews. Sarah's therapist, Dr. Patricia Torres, assigned to her as part of the FBI's Victim Support Services, helped her navigate the attention. "You're not obligated to be anyone's symbol," Torres had said, "but you have power now. Power you didn't have when you were hiding. The question is what you want to do with it." Sarah made a decision. She would do one interview before the trial, one interview that would tell her complete story. She would control the narrative rather than let others control it for her. The interview aired 3 weeks before the trial began. Sarah sat across from a respected journalist named Patricia Nguyen and spoke about everything. Marcus Chen's violence, the night David Caruso died, Detective Walsh's manipulation, her 5 years in hiding, her clinical knowledge acquisition, the Trauma Bay emergency, the FBI's arrival. She spoke about her family, about their 5-year grief, about the phone call that brought them together. She spoke about the Caruso family, about her guilt and her commitment to justice. She spoke about Dr. Martinez and the hospital staff who'd stood by her despite her complicated past. By the time the interview concluded, Sarah was crying, not from pain, but from the relief of finally being seen and understood. The response was galvanizing. Victim advocacy groups organized rallies in support of Detective Walsh's prosecution. Law enforcement oversight committees called for systemic reforms. The Caruso family reached out to Sarah directly, asking if they could meet before the trial. When Sarah met David Caruso's children in person, Marcus Jr., now 31, Rachel, now 19, they embraced her with the intensity of people embracing a ghost who had finally become flesh. "Thank you," Marcus Jr. said simply. "Thank you for not staying silent forever. Thank you for being willing to testify. Thank you for remembering our father." Sarah realized in that moment that her 5 years of hiding had never been about protecting herself. It had been about protecting a system that thrived on her silence. Choosing to testify wasn't about bravery or courage. It was about justice, about closure, about the fundamental human need to have our suffering witnessed and validated. 2 weeks before the trial, Sarah received her final piece of preparation. The prosecutors showed her a video of Marcus Chen, recorded during his federal trial. He was gaunt now, prison-worn, his aggressive confidence replaced by bitter resignation. Watching him, Sarah felt the last threads of fear release from her chest. He was no longer a predator. He was simply a man in a cell, no longer able to hurt anyone. That night in her apartment in Portland, Sarah deleted the anonymous forwarding email account she'd maintained for 5 years. Her escape plan, her emergency exit, her security blanket for the possibility of needing to disappear again. She was done running. The trial would begin in 14 days. Sarah would testify. She would speak David Caruso's name aloud in a courtroom. She would describe in detail what she'd witnessed. She would help dismantle the system that had consumed her life. And then, finally, she would begin to rebuild not a hidden version of herself, but the real, authentic, visible version of Sarah Chen. The woman who'd survived, who'd studied, who'd saved lives, who'd chosen justice over safety. She was terrified, but for the first time in 5 years, she was also ready. The federal courthouse in downtown Portland was crowded on the morning of her testimony. Sarah stood outside the building in a navy dress, professional but not severe, chosen specifically by the prosecutors to convey competence without intimidation. News cameras clustered at the courthouse steps. The media presence had only grown as the trial progressed. Detective Robert Walsh's corruption had captured the public imagination in a way that pure crime statistics never could. Here was a man entrusted with protecting the vulnerable who had instead profited from their terror. Her parents stood beside her, her mother's hand gripping her elbow as if Sarah might vanish again if not held firmly to earth. Her sister stood on her other side, tears streaming silently down her face. They'd flown in from Michigan for this moment. After 5 years of absence, Sarah's family was finally choosing to be visibly present. "You're ready," Jennifer Huang said, squeezing Sarah's shoulder. "Remember everything we practiced. Answer the questions directly. Don't elaborate unless asked. And if you need a moment, ask for water. There's no penalty for composure." The courtroom was smaller than Sarah had expected, more intimate than she'd imagined. Detective Robert Walsh sat at the defense table in an orange federal detention suit, his expression carefully neutral. Beside him were 3 attorneys. Across the room sat the prosecution team, Jennifer, Linda, and several FBI agents including Morrison. The judge, a woman named Margaret Chen, Sarah noticed the shared surname with detached interest, called the court to order. Sarah raised her hand and swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth. The irony was not lost on her. After 5 years of living a lie, she would now spend the day speaking only truth. For 6 hours, she testified. She described meeting Marcus Chen, her naive trust in his sophistication. She detailed the night of March 12, 2019 with clinical precision, the storage facility, the man already injured, the baseball bat, the sounds of violence, the terror. She described the exact words Detective Walsh had spoken when she came to him for help. She recalled the cash he'd given her, the advice about disappearing, the promise that he would build a case quietly. The defense attorneys were brutal in cross-examination, exactly as Jennifer had warned. They suggested she was exaggerating traumatic memory. They implied she'd fabricated details. They asked why, if she was so terrified, she hadn't gone to another detective, another police department, a federal agent immediately. And Sarah, for the first time in her life, didn't flinch from difficult questions. She answered with honesty that came from having already survived the worst outcomes. "I was 23 years old, traumatized from witnessing murder, and I trusted a police officer," she said calmly. "I've learned that was a mistake, but at the time, I made the only choice I thought I could make with the information I had." When the prosecutors showed surveillance footage of Detective Walsh accepting payment from Marcus Chen, Sarah watched the jury's faces harden. This wasn't abstract corruption anymore. This was proof of specific, intentional betrayal. By the time Sarah stepped down from the witness stand, the trial's outcome felt inevitable. The jury took 4 hours to deliberate. The verdict came back at 6 p.m. on a Wednesday, guilty on all counts: racketeering, misconduct under color of authority, accepting bribes, conspiracy. Detective Robert Walsh, 23 years on the police force, was convicted of systematically betraying his oath. In the courthouse hallway afterward, the Caruso family embraced Sarah. David Caruso's son, Marcus Jr., spoke to reporters with his voice shaking. "My father's death finally has a name and a face and a consequence. After 16 years, we can begin to grieve properly. This justice is because a woman was brave enough to speak what she'd been forced to hide. We are forever grateful." Sarah's mother held her daughter and wept openly. Her 5 years of private grief finally permitted public expression. The conviction made national news. Law enforcement oversight organizations cited the case as evidence of the need for systemic reform. Universities began teaching about the Walsh case in criminal justice programs. Detective Robert Walsh became a cautionary tale about the corruption that hides inside institutions designed to protect. But for Sarah, the conviction was simply the end of one chapter. The month after the trial, she traveled to Detroit and stayed with her parents for 2 weeks. Walking through her childhood home felt like stepping into a museum dedicated to the daughter they'd lost. Her bedroom remained largely unchanged, her high school yearbooks on the shelf, her academic awards on the walls, the bed she'd slept in before her life fractured. Her mother had maintained the room as a shrine, unable to fully grieve. Now together they began to transform it. Sarah's mother helped her pack away the most painful artifacts. They created a new vision of the room, not a memorial to loss, but a space that honored the woman Sarah had become. By the time Sarah left, the room reflected the continuity between her past and her present, the girl she'd been and the woman she'd survived to become. When Sarah returned to Portland, the hospital surprised her with a formal ceremony. The emergency medicine department, the trauma unit, and hospital administration gathered to recognize her contributions. Dr. James Martinez presented her with a plaque, in recognition of extraordinary clinical competence and the lives saved through courageous intervention. More importantly, he offered her a formal position as trauma unit educator and mentor, a role that would allow her to train new nurses while continuing her own clinical practice. "You have something unique to teach," Dr. Martinez said in front of the assembled staff. "Not just medical knowledge, but the capacity to function with clarity and purpose under the most extreme pressure. That's a skill we need to cultivate." 6 months after the trial, Sarah stood in the trauma bay of St. Grace Medical Center, training 2 new nurses in crisis protocols. One of them, a woman named Jennifer who reminded Sarah of herself from years past, eager, nervous, trying to build something real from nothing, asked, "How do you stay so calm under pressure?" Sarah paused, considering the question carefully. "I learned a long time ago that panic serves no one, that fear and action can coexist, that survival sometimes requires you to function beyond what you thought possible. You learn it, and then you become it." She didn't mention that she'd learned those lessons through 5 years of hiding, through witnessing murder, through lying to everyone she knew. Trauma was her education. Survival was her thesis, and the lives she'd saved had been her proof that something forged in darkness could create light. A year after the trial, Sarah was promoted to Assistant Director of Trauma Services. She moved to a larger apartment, one with windows, with photographs on the walls, with the comfortable clutter of someone who no longer feared leaving traces of their existence. Her parents visited Portland and met her colleagues. Linda gave them a private tour of the trauma bay where their daughter had first revealed her extraordinary competence. Her mother wept again, this time tears of pride rather than grief. On the 5th anniversary of that first emergency, the day she'd saved 7 lives, Sarah attended a reunion with her patients. They came to the hospital to thank her, to tell her their recovery stories, to acknowledge that they were alive because a rookie nurse had moved with impossible competence. The pregnant woman who delivered a healthy baby 6 months after the emergency brought her child, a beautiful 6-year-old girl named Sarah. "We named her after you," the mother said, "because you saved us both." That night in her apartment, Sarah looked at the photographs on her walls, pictures of her family, pictures with Dr. Martinez and her colleagues, pictures of her patients and their children, a life fully visible, fully documented, fully real. She thought about the woman she'd been 5 years ago, the invisible ghost who'd haunted hospital corridors and coffee shops and empty apartments. That woman had survived through hiding, but survival had never been the point. Healing was the point. Connection was the point. Purpose was the point. Sarah Chen, who had also been Sarah Patterson, who had also been invisible, who had also been terrified, had finally become fully herself. Not because the danger had passed, not because the trauma had disappeared, but because she'd chosen to transform her suffering into meaning, her silence into voice, her isolation into community. She was a nurse. She was a survivor. She was a woman who'd testified against corruption and helped dismantle a system designed to hide truth. She was a mentor to new nurses, passing forward the lessons learned through trauma. And she was finally, completely, irreversibly home, not in a place but in herself. In the ER, when new crises arose and trauma patients flooded through the doors, Sarah moved with the quiet competence of someone who'd conquered monsters far more terrifying than any medical emergency. Her hands knew what to do. Her mind understood the stakes. Her heart remembered why it all mattered. 5 years of running had become a lifetime of purpose. And the journey, from victim to survivor to healer to advocate, had not been redemptive in the Hollywood sense. It had been slow, painful, necessary. It had required her to face the darkest moments of her past, to speak truths she'd wanted to bury forever, to allow herself to be seen by people who might reject what they saw. But she had survived, and in surviving she'd learned that trauma doesn't define us. Neither does hiding, neither does fear. What defines us is what we choose to do with the ashes of our previous lives. And Sarah Chen had chosen to build something beautiful. The END Share Artifacts Download All Image Generation Prompts Document. MD Part 8 Expanded 1000 Words Document. MD Part 7 Expanded 1000 Words Document. MD Part 6 Expanded 1000 Words Document. MD Part 5 Expanded 1000 Words Document. MD Part 4 Expanded 1000 Words Document. MD Part 3 Expanded 1000 Words Document. MD Part 2 Expanded 1000 Words Document. MD Part 1 Expanded 1000 Words Document. MD Rookie Nurse Story Document. MD